if you are new with us. Last week, we did begin our command-by-command journey through the Ten Commandments in order to look at who God is, his character, and how we, as those who are made in his image and bear his name, how we should live in light of that. And each of the first 4 commandments address a different tendency. So there's 10 commandments. Each of the first of them address a different tendency of humanity to try to minimize God's role in our life and the world. And today we're going to look at the second of those commandments. And it comes to us in Exodus chapter 20, verses 4 through 6. All right? It reads like this: "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, the earth below, or the earth beneath, or the waters below." Now, what does that sound like to you? If I can get it on the screen. What does that sound like to you? Genesis chapter 1, right? Okay, so this is a hearkening back to the creation account. So don't make an image of anything that looks like it is of creation, right? I created all the things in heaven. I created all the things that move along the ground. I created all the things in the water. You don't make an image that looks anything like those things. You shall not bow down or worship them. Okay, so don't worship creaturely things. And then he goes on to say, "For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of their parents to the 3rd and 4th generation." Okay, I am a just God, but also I am a merciful God, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and to keep my commandments, who keep my covenant. All right? So this is the second commandment that we will be wrestling with this morning. And it's similar to the first commandment in the sense that it reveals to us a very big God, but it does so in a different way, right? So last week we talked about how the first commandment confronts us with the question, are we trivializing God's place in our life? Today, as we look at the second commandment, it's going to confront us with this question: are we trying to domesticate God? Are we trying to tame God, the creator and the sustainer and the savior of all things, and therefore the Lord of over all things, into something that me and you can comprehend and therefore can control? And the passage Allison just read over us really helps us wrestle with that question. And it comes from Exodus chapter 32. And it's kind of a weird passage, kind of like last week we looked at Ezekiel chapter 8, and it was this weird passage because I had shrines and sacrifices, and this is the same way, right? You have this golden calf, and they make this, and it all just feels really foreign to us. And because it's so foreign to us, and I don't think any of us are in danger of gathering all the gold in this room and melting it down and it's not that we probably couldn't, we don't even have the capacities in this. I don't know. We have a couple welders. Y'all maybe could pull this off for us. And, but like most of us couldn't, melt things down and build a calf and then worship it. Like that's not going to happen in our modern day. We are enlightened people, right? So that's not going to happen. And so I want us to provide a little bit of context to the passage Allison read over us. As we provide context to it, I think you'll understand the heart of what's happening here, okay? So think about the beginning of the book of Exodus, right? So the first 19 chapters tell of, there's 40 chapters in Exodus, and the first 19 tell of Israel's exit out of the nation of Egypt, right? And so they exited Egypt, and think about those stories. I mean, if you grew up in church, these are stories that are really familiar to you. These are the stories that we reenact in VBS, right? But just think about it, right? You have the burning bush. You have the 10 plagues, right, which are things that you would have tangibly seen and felt and heard, right? You have, right, one of them's the darkness covers the land for 3 days. One of them's lice, I think is one of them, grasshoppers and locusts just swarming, all the livestock die. And then we have what we call the Passover, in which the firstborn in all of Egypt die, including some of the livestock, right? I mean, these are things that you would have been able to see and perceive with your 5 senses, right? You also have in the first 19 chapters of the book of Exodus, you have the parting of the Red Sea, the crossing on dry ground, that Red Sea closing up behind you to destroy the Egyptian army that is chasing after you. You have manna and quail at day and night being given to you, rock coming forth from a water. You have the tangible defeat of the Amalekites. In the first 19 chapters of the book of Exodus, God is moving in very tangible ways on Israel's behalf, ways that they can perceive with their five senses. They could touch and taste and hear and smell and see all the things that God was doing in their midst and on their behalf. But then in Exodus chapter 20, everything for the Israelites, other than Moses, seemingly changes. It's a halt to all that tangible action. And for what we read as 11 chapters, but it's 40 days, Moses, it says, is up on Mount Sinai, and he's having this conversation with God, but surrounding them is all this billowing smoke on the top of Mount Sinai. And so if you're an Israelite down at the bottom, you don't know what's happening anymore for 40 days. And my question for you, and you can talk in church, how would that feel to you? If you're at the bottom, like literally you can talk in church, I want your response. How would that feel to you if you're at the bottom of the mountain for 11 chapters, 40 days, God has worked in all these tangible ways, you're at the bottom of Mount Sinai, and all you see now is billowing smoke, and you don't know what's happening? How do you feel? That's a long time, one at a time, and very loud. Someone else. Scared. I'm scared half to death. What in the world? Has Moses died? I wouldn't know it. There's tons of smoke, and probably so. This is the guy, we know God let us out, but really it seems like God was working through Moses, so he's the one who had the burning bush moment, not me. All right, who else? What else are you feeling? Lost, frustrated, confused, right? I mean, you are at minimum confused, and at worst, you are thinking that we are all about to die, all right? God was no longer moving in ways that the Israelites could understand. And he began now working in ways that went beyond the Israelites' comprehension. And so what Allison read for us is their response to that feeling of confusion and scaredness and that sense of, this has been a long time. They melt down all the gold jewelry in the camp. They form a calf, and they begin to worship it. But notice what Aaron and the people say about this calf, okay? We're going to pick up in verse 4, and as we get to this, it's going to get to the heart of the second commandment, because while Moses is up on Mount Sinai receiving the second commandment, the people below are breaking it. This is your God, Israel. And by the way, usually I read out of the NIV, if I can get that up on the screen. Usually I read out of the NIV, but I'm using the NASB, which is the New American Standard Bible, because it's much more exact, and we need to get exact, because it's not God's, as your Bible might say. It is, this is your God, Israel, who brought you from the land of Egypt. Now, when Aaron saw this, okay, so this is the same God. This calf is the same God that delivered you from Egypt. Now, when Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow we shall have a feast unto the, which stands for Yahweh. Aaron goes before the people of Israel, and he says, this calf made out of gold, this calf that me and you have shaped with our own hands, it is Yahweh, the God that led you out of Egypt. It is not another God, it is God himself. You see, the moment God began working in ways that were beyond the Israelites' comprehension and therefore beyond their control, or their perceived control, they shrunk God down into a size they could understand. They turned the self-sufficient God of creation, who spoke all that we can see and taste and touch and hear and smell, into a creature himself, into a calf still dependent upon its mother for milk. That's the point of the second commandment. Don't do that. Don't shrink God into something that you can comprehend and therefore can control. Because that is not who God is. I'm the God of the Exodus. I'm beyond your comprehension. My justice is beyond your comprehension, and certainly my mercy is beyond your capacities to understand. Right? That's the point of the second commandment. My mom, I think I talked about this in class last week, but my mom is this kind of formidable social figure, in my opinion. She always has a witty saying or Southern proverb to share with you just at any occasion. And one of the things that she always used to share with me is probably something you've said to your child, which has been, you can't have your cake and... right? And she would just, you wield that like a sword against me, Ben. You can't have your cake and eat it too when I wanted something. And that's really the problem of the second commandment. We can't have our cake and eat it too. We can either have the God of the Exodus, a God who is beyond our comprehension, who is beyond our control, but who is good and great, who is merciful and mighty, a God who is willing and able to act on our behalf, or we can have a God who is utterly tamed, one that we can control, one that we can comprehend and therefore manipulate, and yet is just merely a calf dependent upon its mother for milk. Do you want a God that's greater than you, who can actually change the world in your life? Or do you want a God who is less than you and therefore has no power to actually affect this world? That's the question with which we are confronted again and again and again, each and every day by the second commandment. Will we worship a God who holds us, or whom me and you can hold? Will we conceive of a God whom we can master, or who is master over us? Will we serve a God who is greater than us, or whom we are greater than? And so today, I want us to spend the rest of our time looking at three different ways we are tempted to domesticate God, and how the God that is revealed in the Christian scriptures, the Bible, is so much greater than any conception we might have of him. All right? So, the first thing that I want us to really wrestle with today is this. God, the God of the Bible, is greater than your conception of him. Okay, so a good rule to live by as Christians is this. We have never fully comprehended God, and if we think we have made a major mistake. For part of what it means to understand who God is to understand that we cannot fully understand him. All right? Now, there was a preacher in the mid-1900s in Philadelphia named Donald Gray Barnhouse, and he would go around and he would preach at all the local universities in Philadelphia, and I think this particular occasion he was preaching at the University of Temple, right? If you've heard of that, and he's preaching at the University of Temple, and one night he's sharing there, and he's talking about how the Israelites' 40-year stint in the wandering of the wilderness. And if you remember the story, it says that the soles of their shoes never wore out, right? You remember this? So the soles of their shoe never wore out. And a skeptic in the crowd stands up and kind of sarcastically rebuts, how in the world do you wear shoes for 40 years and they never wear out? And as the tension rises in the auditorium, Donald Gray Barnhouse was said to have stepped out from behind the pulpit, and he broke the silence yelling, God! And the student who had sarcastically rebutted, some say because he was humbled, I think it's because at this point he didn't want any further conflict, said, oh, I understand. But then Barnhouse said these words that, in my opinion, capture so beautifully the essence of the second commandment. He said, no, son, nobody understands. A God small enough that I could understand him is not a God great enough for me to worship. A God small enough that I can understand him is not a God great enough for me to worship. See, a God worth worshiping is also a God who is greater than us. And if God is greater than us, then that means that God can make a claim on our life. It is a God who can challenge us, who can correct us, who can confront us, who can contradict us. It is a God who can rightfully give us the 10 Commandments. A God who can rightfully tell us, you shall and you shall not. You see, I think we often don't envision a God who is deserving of our worship, because that is also a God who could dictate our lives. There's a God who could demand something of us, and that makes us uncomfortable. It doesn't feel safe. It makes us feel out of control. And so we try to tame and domesticate God quite often into our own image. This is the way the Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire put it. He said, in the beginning, God created man, and ever since, man has been returning the favor. There is a New Testament scholar, if I can think that quote should show up on the screen too. There's a New Testament scholar, no, that's my bad. Just leave the other one up. That's my bad. I should have put it in. There's a New Testament scholar named Scott McKnight, and he was teaching, he taught for a long time at a school that had freshmen, and he always gave them a test. It was a freshman class called Jesus of Nazareth, okay? And so this class was supposed to introduce all these kids to who Jesus is, and he'd have them take a test at the beginning of the class, and it would be 2 tests, okay? And the first, he would ask them all these questions about Jesus, and then he would ask them all these questions about themselves. Like, are you introverted or extroverted? Are you this or are you that, right? And the point of it was not to understand who they are and to understand who Jesus is, but rather when you compare the 2 tests, what do you think he found? Jesus was always just like them. We have tamed God into nothing greater than a superized version of who I am, right? It is Jesus is nothing more than my best self, or my best vision of myself, what I ideally would be in this world. That's who Jesus must be. There's a lot of ways this manifests in our life. One of the ways is that when we act like we've arrived spiritually, like I've got my act together and you don't, right? So like the Pharisees fall into the second commandment. They tamed God into something they can control. I'm going to follow all these rules, right? Also, just when people show up to church with such a nonchalance and without any reverence, probably means we've tamed God into something that's safe, and therefore we can approach with kind of a casual, oh, hey, God is, think about the passage Isaiah 6 when Isaiah sees the Lord. And the year King Uzziah died, who was a good king and a long-serving king, he died. I saw the one true living God. And it was terrifying. And he says, not wow, but he says, woe to me, when the glory of the Lord was revealed to him, right? This sense of God is just kind of this safe buddy. I think my dad, I don't know if y'all remember the Burger King guy back in the day. This is probably the 90s when I was a kid, and Burger King, and they had that and he was the king, And, my dad would make the point, we just kind of see Jesus as that Burger King guy. He has his thumb up, and he's, just hunky-dory. We've tamed God. I think this also happened, so when we act like we can arrive spiritually, or as if that's a possibility, that we don't need to grow anymore, I think we've probably tamed who God is in some ways. The other way I think this manifests itself quite a bit is I call them Instagrammable verses, okay? So this, every college student would come into my midst, and they would have something like Jeremiah 29, 11, for the Lord has his plans and purposes for you, yada, 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 or something like that. We're still on the last one. I'm sorry, Elijah. And he would say, and it's, the Lord knows his plans and purposes for you, plans to prosper you. It's a nice sounding verse, right? And, I always like to make the point, by the way, that's about the Israelites spending 70 years in exile in Babylon, so we've missed the point of that verse, okay? But we just reduce God to nothing more than these kind of Instagrammable verses, taking out of context. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And that doesn't mean he's changed my life. He just gives me to do the strength of things I already wanted to do. Have we domesticated who God is, right? I call them Instagrammable verses. I was listening to someone else, and he talked about the crocheted verses, right? What are the verses that you have in your house that are crocheted? And we take the verses that we've turned into the song of the greatest commandments: love, hopes, and believes, and trust all things. And take that out of context, and doesn't it feel nice? That God does not challenge me. That God is certainly telling me you shall and you shall not. That God just loves me. Isn't it sweet? And by the way, it is sweet to know that God loves us. And it is sweet to know that even in the midst of our exile, God has good plans and purposes for us. It isn't that those things aren't true, but have we reduced God to nothing more than those things? Have we domesticated him to what we believe to be the safe parts of the Bible? Does that make sense? Can your God contradict you? If not, then you have reduced him. As I said earlier, right, as Christians, part of what it means to understand who God is in a full way is to admit that we cannot fully understand him. This is what Isaiah 55 says: my ways are higher than your ways. Job 36, God is exalted and we do not know him. Jeremiah 10, there is none like you, O Lord. Ephesians 3, to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think. It's not just that God does more than we ask him to do. It's that God can do more than we could possibly imagine he could do. This is 1 Timothy chapter 6, King of kings, Lord of lords, who alone possesses immortality and dwells in unapproachable light, who no man has seen or can see. Acts 17, the God who made the world and everything in it is Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everything and everyone life and breath and everything else. I love that line, as if he needed anything, as if he needed you and me. Now, this does not mean, a very important distinction as we wrap up this point, this does not mean that God is unknowable. Think about the Ten Commandments. They are first and foremost divine revelation, as we talked about. God revealing himself to his people and his world. But it does mean this: God is not comprehensible and therefore not controllable. God is knowable only because he has chosen to reveal himself to us. And he does so in ways that we can understand. But if we were to truly see him like Isaiah did, we would unravel at the seams. So it isn't that God is unknowable. We can know him. He has made it possible for us to follow him. He sent Jesus Christ into the world so that we might know him. But he is not a controllable God. The second thing that I want us to see this morning is that the God of Scripture, the God of the Bible, is also greater than our religious activity. Okay? I think another way we try to minimize God and reduce him and tame him is to make him nothing more than our religious activity. A mistake I think that's often made in legalistic church settings, which many of you have experienced, is that we reduce God into something secondary or less than or periphery to our religious activity. And I think this, let me put it this way, we place humanity at the center and have Christ revolve around us, rather than having Christ at the center and us revolve around him, right? We reduce him to something that is less than central. We say, he isn't the sun that holds everything else in orbit. I might be. He's periphery, okay? And I think this usually manifests in one of two ways. Either we place the church doctrine or how we execute worship, what happens between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning, which is the only thing God cares about, you know what I mean? And have you been in churches like that? And we reduce church to nothing more than that, and Christ is just kind of happening on the periphery. Or right, we place ourselves and our own morality, our own kind of moral striving and rectitude at the center and have God revolve around us as an individual, okay? Or, by the way, this can kind of be a combo of the two, where it's like I'm being really good at church, and that's what I place at the center. Like it's me good at church that's, kind of, and that's the center, and Christ revolves around that. This is the way that the pastor Tim Keller puts it, though, if I can get this on the screen. He says, idolatry functions widely inside of religious communities when doctrinal truth is elevated to a position of a false god. Okay, so that's when we take something about God and we reduce him to nothing more than that one thing. This occurs when people rely on the rightness of their doctrine for their standing with God rather than God himself. And that is a subtle but deadly mistake. By the way, in the churches of Christ, is this not something that we have done? He continues on and he says, another form of idolatry within religious communities turns spiritual gifts and ministry success into a counterfeit God. Okay, so this is the idea, this is the combo of the two. I'm really good at church. If you are in church leadership, I think this is a pretty strong temptation, or at least it is for me. Another kind of religious idolatry has to do with moral living itself. Though we may give lip service to Jesus as our example and our inspiration, we are still looking to ourselves and our own moral striving for our salvation. Making an idol out of doctrinal accuracy, ministry success, or our own moral rectitude leads to constant internal conflict, arrogance, self-righteousness, and the oppression of those whose views differ. Now, these postures, as we said, they put humanity at the center and Christ on the periphery. Think about that, how it breaks the second commandment. It reduces the creator and the sustainer and the savior of all things, and therefore Lord over all things, into something that is periphery to us, the created and the saved and the sustained. Now, when I put it that way, that seems absolutely nonsensical. None of us would ever do something so stupid, right? And yet, this is a grave, grave temptation for us. And the question is why? Why is this so tempting? Why is it so tempting to reduce God to nothing more than our religious activity or our religious living? And I think, in short, it's because it's easier to control religion than it is to control God. I mean, think about it this way, right? It is easier for me and you to fight over doctrine, and let's particularly say the doctrine of grace, than it is for us to actually trust in God's grace, right? It is easier for us to debate exactly how we should worship in church than for all of us to recognize that there's a being who created us that's beyond our comprehension. It is easier for us to squabble about, can you do this between the hours of 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. on Sunday morning in this auditorium? That's something we feel like we can control, than it is for us to admit that there is the creator of all things who's beyond our comprehension and therefore is beyond our control. Right? It is easier, think about this, right? It is easier for us to be good at church than it is for us to actually give God glory. Right? It's easy to be good at church. Using all the same muscle memory of what you would have being good at, by the way, for those of you who are hot, I'm burning up here, okay? Just know that. I'm saying amen to you if you're hot in the pews, because I'm wearing this. I didn't even notice, I didn't even recognize, I'm wearing my Ben shirt where all the Bens are wearing their shirts this morning. I'm sweating. I need like one of those rags. But I'm not done. I'm not cutting. I'm actually going to cut my sermon short. I'm cutting the third point. I'm just letting y'all know that. You're welcome. All right, but let me jump back into where I was. It is easier for us, right, to be good at church using all the same muscle memory that we would have at being good at climbing the corporate ladder and good at climbing the academic ladder. And we just wield that in church, and we're good at church. You know, I can talk about God in front of people. I can do that. I can read a script. I can do all these things that make me good at church, and I can present myself as an upstanding human being. You know, I can be good at church. That's easy. I can control that. But you know what's really difficult? Actually giving God glory, in which we radically reorient our lives, in which I'm no longer the center and He is. That's difficult. And so we tame and reduce God to something periphery to my religious activities about Him. It's easier for us to check off a list of do's and don'ts than it is to follow Jesus all the way, even to the cross. When Christ is centered on us, we are in control. But when Christ is in His rightful place as the center not just of our lives, but the whole of the cosmos, He is, and we are uncomfortable with where He might lead us, right? Because He does say, deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. We're going to skim over the third point, which is basically this. Part of the reason why we have the second commandment that we aren't supposed to make an image of God is that God has already given this world an image, right? And by the way, that image is me and it is you. You were made in the image of God. God is, do you know that it's the same word for idol as the same word for image in Genesis chapter 1? We are an idol. You, in and of yourself, you are rightfully an idol. And as you live as an idol, something that represents God to the world, that you are fulfilling your divinely intended purpose. And by the way, I'm just quickly making these points. I think we reject that for two reasons, both because they're not safe. The first is we reject that because if I'm made in God's image, that means God has a claim on my life. So think about the politics lessons we did. We looked at Jesus' response to, shall we pay this imperial tax or not? And He says, get out a denarius, which has Caesar's face on it. And He says, whose image and inscription is it? And they say, Caesar's, right? And He says, fine, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but render unto God what is God's. Okay, fine, that coin is made in Caesar's image. Give it back to Caesar. But in whose image are you made? God. That means God gets all of you. Caesar made that coin for a purpose. That coin's going to live into that purpose. But God has made you for a purpose, and the only way to rightfully live is to live into that purpose. God, we are made in God's image. Therefore, God has a claim on our life, and it's not a safe claim. The other point is we also have to recognize that the fact that means other people bear God's image, which means how we treat them reveals how we are treating God. Every person you interact with is an altar to the divine. Do you treat them as such? Do you discard them? Do you treat them as a nuisance, as a problem, as somebody to be gotten rid of because they are different and other, or just merely confusing and annoying? At this point, you might want to get rid of me because I told you I was skipping the third point and making it anyways. Let me close with this, and this is the last thing for us. I think some of you will deeply appreciate it, but it comes from the Chronicles of Narnia, and most of you at this point know where I'm going. But in the first book that was written by C.S. Lewis, The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, the I'm pronouncing their names wrong. I don't know. The kids show up, and they're confused in this new land, and they hear about this great kind of figure of Aslan, okay? And the youngest of them, Lucy, asks, is he a man? And they're in the Beaver's house, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver's house. They're such kindly figures. And Mr. Beaver sternly says, Aslan, a man? Certainly not. I tell you, he is the king of the wood, the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of the beast? Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Ooh, said Susan. I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous meeting a lion. Isaiah would agree. That you will, dearie, and make no mistake, said Miss Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either brave or just silly. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Do you hear what Miss Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He is the king, I tell you. Do you want the God of the Exodus? A God beyond our comprehension and therefore our control, but yet is a God who is good and great, merciful and mighty, willing and able to act on our behalf. A God who is not safe, but is the great and good king. Or do you want a God who is less than you and who cannot affect the world or your life, but is one that you can control? That's the question this morning. If you want to respond to that question by either realigning yourself with that great truth, that you want to align yourself with the great and good king, or you want to immerse yourself in that great truth through the waters of baptism, we invite you to come forward as we stand and as we sing, or meet one of our shepherds in the back. Thank you all.